Good morning. Let's get started. Well, last week we had an interruption to the teaching. We had a going away lunch for some new Christians, the Campbells. And so I thought today we just very briefly remember what we've been studying, which is different influences on our thinking, different influences on worldviews that people have in our culture. And we were talking about moral relativism. And relativism is the idea that rather than truth always being absolute, that truth could be dependent on context, whether it's the cultural context of a particular culture or the context of the individual's psyche and so on. And only a few philosophers would believe that absolutely no truth is absolute. Most people aren't interested in denying that if I drop this, it's going to go down and hit the floor. Most people are engaged in relativism primarily with respect to morality. So we took a look at some of the Bible verses last week that affirm that for the Christian and the Jew, truth is absolute. We saw Bible verses in particular that said God's word is truth and God is truth, and that Jesus is the truth, the way and the life, and no one comes to the Father except through him. And the truth, if you know it, will set you free. And all of these are statements that truth is absolute in the moral and spiritual sense, not just with respect to basic scientific facts. And we took a look at the fact that for millennia, essentially everyone believed this. Everyone, even pagans, believed that there was such a thing as truth and that it was our job to discover it. And so there was actually a common denominator between even Christians and pagans in this one respect. You could try to convince a pagan that Christianity was true, and they didn't want to have a debate about what does true mean. They believed in something that they thought was true. You could persuade them that's not all true. Let me tell you about the truth. Today, in our society, it's becoming much harder because whereas as Paul encountered in the book of Acts when he preached to people who had preconceived notions, like when he was on Mars Hill and he preached to Stoic and Epicurean philosophers, they had certain preconceived notions that were not compatible with Christianity. They had already considered, for example, the possibility of resurrection and rejected it. So Paul had his work cut out for him, but when he talked to them, they didn't say, there's no such thing as truth, so this is all a waste of time. There was at least a discussion about what is true. Whereas today, you're more likely to encounter, well, that's your truth, or that might be true for you, but not for me. That's the direction that our culture has been headed. One of the things that changed was that as opposed to saying truth is determined by God, truth, whatever's in the mind of God is what is true. If God says something is good, it's good. If God says something is true, it's true. During the medieval era, the attitude became whatever the church says, meaning what we would call the Roman Catholic Church today. Whatever the church says is true. But then when the church became corrupted, the church began to lose some credibility. This led to the Protestant Reformation. It led to a different rejection of the church that's referred to as the Age of Enlightenment. Once the idea is that whatever the church says is what's true, is combined with a lack of trust in the church, a loss of faith in the church because of its corruption, then that begins to affect what people perceive of as truth. And through a centuries-long process, we arrive where we are today, where people aren't sure that things are true, that there is any such thing. Now, there's a type of relativism that's related to moral relativism that we haven't talked about, aesthetic relativism. You've heard the saying, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Well, is that really true? Because philosophers from ancient times on had several major questions they wanted to address. What is truth? What is good? And what is beauty? And even pagan philosophers believed that some things were true and other things were not true. Some things were good, other things were not. And some things were beautiful and other things were not. So I ran this little experiment when I was teaching the 5th and 6th graders a couple of years ago. If I showed you a picture of a garbage dump, a landfill, and I showed you a picture of a sunset over the Grand Canyon, do you think it would just be a matter of opinion which of these is more beautiful? And when you think about it, well, that's kind of silly, although, well, just in case. I recall that Willow was always challenging me to prove everything I said, so I enjoyed that, actually. She's rather spunky, I like that. Makes for a good class. But is it really true that everything is subjective when it comes to the subject of beauty? I don't think that people really believe that, certainly not to the extreme. And this subject of aesthetic relativism and its connection to moral relativism is something that was brought out. I reread this book just recently because of this topic. C.S. Lewis, you probably heard of, he wrote many good Christian fundamental books, and one of them is called The Abolition of Man. And what triggered him to write the book was, and this was 1947, so this is not some recent problem in our day. He was reading a textbook for what we would call high schoolers in England. And in the textbook, they related a famous story from the writings of the poet William Taylor Coleridge, where he was hiking to a waterfall, and there's this beautiful waterfall, and there are other people there with him, and one of the people with him says, "That's sublime." Now, if you look up the definition of sublime, noble, majestic, of high spiritual, moral, or intellectual worth, not to be excelled, supreme. So she was saying something about the nature of that water. And another woman, her said, "It's pretty." Well, Coleridge thought enough of the subject to object. No, it's not just pretty. That doesn't really describe the waterfall. Your friend is right, it's sublime. But in this textbook that C.S. Lewis was looking at for high schoolers in England, the textbook authors, a couple of men who he keeps anonymous, explain helpfully to the high school students that because he recognized that what's going on here is a shift from saying there's something about the nature of this waterfall to merely saying there's something subjective in me. I have certain feelings. We move from objectively speaking, this is a majestic waterfall, to, well, subjectively speaking, I like it. And that's a huge shift that he recognized. And he wrote a book about the connection of this way of thinking to truth and what it does to us when everything becomes a matter of opinion. Everything's about feelings, and there's nothing true anymore. You recognize what a danger that is. And he titled it The Abolition of Man. If you think about it, what is mankind? Is mankind created in the image of God and therefore very special compared to animals? Well, to the Christian, yes. We go back to Genesis 1:26 and 27. Man and woman were created in the image of God. And we talked before this quarter about that influences how we treat other people, doesn't it? But if there is no God to ground truth, if you don't believe in God, then what is left to make man special? Do you feel like people are special? What's the, you feel it, that's all it is. Maybe you feel like human beings are special because you're flattering yourself. Maybe you like that feeling of being special compared to animals and plants and so on. If you can't ground truth in God's mind, then ultimately where you're going to head, and it's taken us several centuries to arrive here, is that everything's just an opinion. Everything's just your feelings. Well, that's pretty shaky ground. I don't want my worth to be based on your feelings. I don't want you to say, well, I think this person over here is very special compared to animals, but not this person, based on my feelings toward those people. What happens when people start defining whole groups of people as not being really special compared to animals? What has happened in history? The great massacres and genocide and so on in history always start with defining certain people as not being really human. Slavery required that kind of thing. If we take away someone's image bearing of God and say it's all about my feelings, well, maybe I don't have very good feelings about certain people. That's pretty dangerous. And C.S. Lewis recognized where this kind of subjective, everything's based on my feelings, is going to lead to. It's going to lead to a denial of morality. And where is that going to lead? Now, we don't usually like to talk about what someone's motivations are, but when we evangelize, when we talk with people in our culture, we need to understand how they arrived where they are. One of the books that I've been drawing upon to look at these worldviews called Hidden Worldviews, they make a distinction between moral relativism and moral relativism with scare quotes around it. Because one is a philosophical position, but most people you run into are not philosophers, and they're not holding a philosophical position. So when most people say, well, truth is relative, or whatever, where are they coming from? And their conclusion is the scare quotes kind, of the popular kind of moral relativism, is really focusing on what they're rejecting. They're rejecting legalism or very impersonal application of rules or harshness. They're rebelling against truth. Now, as Christians, we can address these concerns, and next week I want to talk because one of the things we should do at church is to equip. And I want to equip us all to be ready to speak to someone. Because when someone has a very different view of the world than you do as a Christian, it's very easy to not know how to communicate with them. To just say, well, I don't believe that. That's not. So someone says, I think truth is relative. That's so far away from the Christian perspective that sometimes you don't know what to say. Besides, well, I don't agree. How can we be more persuasive and how can we connect with people? And what's even more subtle to address is the basic motivation is, I want freedom, so don't judge me. That's really what's behind moral relativism. And it's also what's behind aesthetic relativism. Don't judge my taste in movies and TV and music and art and so on. Don't say I don't have a proper appreciation for beauty. I don't want you judging my taste. So it's what's behind that, really. So next week we'll talk about how to deal with that. But there's an aspect that actually had its origins in theologians, which is sad. There's something in philosophy called nominalism. Now, philosophers, once again, always trying to reason what's good, what's true, what's beautiful. They came to the conclusion, going as far back as at least as Plato, that there are certain things that are universal ideas. And then there are instances of those ideas. So there's a universal idea, mankind. And each of us is just an instance of it. Plato reasoned we have that way of approaching everything in nature. We have an idea of what the word tree means. Do all trees look the same? No, so there must be all these different trees of different sizes and shapes. There must be some universal idea of tree that's ingrained in us. What's a table? Well, if you start defining table, you'll run astray because you'll start saying, well, it's got 4 legs and it's got a couple of, wait a minute, do all tables have 4 legs? I've got a breakfast room table that's got a central pillar underneath my knuckle. I've seen tables with 6 legs. Long. So it becomes hard to define something. And so the philosophical approach was to say there's a concept, table, and then there's different examples, but they're still part of the same concept. Well, some of the medieval philosophers, including prominently William of Ockham, would say these words, cat, dog, table, chair, these aren't coming from the mind of God. They're just our labels. I'm simplifying the explanation here, but nominalism comes from the root of the word name. The idea was we give names to things. And that's just our decision. But the realist philosophers, basically all philosophers up to that point, said that no, there are universal truths that are in the mind of God, or they're in some sort of supernatural realm. It's not just your opinion, it's not just a name, it's not just human language games. There is such a thing as truth. It exists in the mind of God. And what this shift, when nominalism was invented, this is actually a very important shift. It's another book written about the same time as C.S. Lewis' book, a famous book called Ideas Have Consequences. author was observing, and he was way ahead of his time in 1948. He was way ahead of his time because today we see the fruits of nominalism. He wrote a whole book on where does this idea lead that everything is just an arbitrary name by that we give. He could never have dreamed in 1948 that we would come to a day when people would say, what's a man? What's a woman? Now, those are just our arbitrary labels. They can be whatever we make them to be. What does marriage mean? What does family mean? What do we hear today? Well, whatever we make them to mean. Those are just our words. Those are just our labels. Who would ever have thought that we would have people who refuse to answer, as we have seen on our own TV screens, what is a woman? They're afraid to answer. That's the world we're living in right now. It's whatever I want it to be or whatever any person wants it to be. They sound crazy. Would have sounded really crazy in 1948 when the book was written, but he was already seeing this is where we're going. Everything is arbitrary, everything's subjective, everything's just a matter of opinion. Well, everything means everything, even the most fundamental things.
So is that not godlessness?
Yes, that's where I think that moral relativism, nominalism, these are where you end up when you can't start with God as the foundation of what truth is. If you can't start with God as the foundation of what truth is, eventually you're going to end up with the conclusion it's all just a matter of opinion. Everything's just a matter of opinion and feelings.
So Christians, when they are baptized to become Christians, and a few months later they don't feel the need to be part of the church community because they stay at home and worship God when they're done physically. I mean, that's
We address,
godlessness.
well, we address that as an example of the excessive individualism, when we did a week on individualism, the excessive individualism of our culture permeating the church, changing attitudes within the church. You know, everything around us is well, not everything, but there are elements in our culture that are so individualistic that they isolate us from the community. They isolate us from each other. So I don't know that I would say that they are erring when they do that. I would say they become godless, but I would say that they've allowed a cultural attitude to creep into their Christianity that isn't compatible with Christianity.
But that's where our role comes in as Christians to keep that person, teach that person.
Yeah.
And over time, they'll gain more skills to realize that when you start picking and choosing what you feel the Bible says, then you're going to look past His instructions.
Right. Well, in general, the teaching function of the church community is to keep an eye on the things that are not compatible with the Christian faith that are in the world out there that can seep into the Christian faith, to be on alert and to teach each other how to spot them and what to do about them. And that's really what this quarter is about, is to say, let's take a look out there at things that seem very foreign to us, but they can creep into the church. They can creep into Christians' way of thinking. We see around us in the world that whenever somebody wants to escape any kind of judgment, moral, aesthetic, whatever, they fall back on relativism. And it seems to work. And so we can pick up on it and start employing it ourselves if we're not careful. We can say, hey, that's a pretty clever trick. As soon as I don't like what somebody's saying, I say, you can't do it. And it seems to work for them, so I'm going to start doing it. That's kind of an unconscious thing. Things out there can creep into the church. So next week we'll conclude this topic by looking at more how can we persuade others when they are falling into this moral relativism. And how would you persuade somebody who doesn't start out accepting, say, the Bible? You really can't just quote the Bible. How would you persuade them? That's one of the things we need to do. Thank you for your time.